I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we're going to welcome a dear friend and friend of the show, Jack Adam Weber. He's a Chinese medicine practitioner, an activist, an author, and a facilitator. Jack's just recently published his book, Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. Let's give a warm welcome to Jack Adam Weber. All right, welcome back to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And this is about the first week or so into December 2020, the longest year in human history. And I'm very pleased to be wrapping up this year of interviews and lots of curated content and so on, with a conversation with one of my favorite people in the collapse-aware community and one of my favorite people in the world at large, a man named Jack Adam Weber. He's a Chinese healing professional and a writer of some renown. You know, I've had the pleasure, if you're a longtime watcher of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, you've probably seen a handful of Jack's and my escapades as when we get together and we start to riff off, you know, what's the possibility of being collapse aware and being fully alive and vibrantly connected and really engaged with being creative and so on, even in the face of knowing the scale and scope of what's happening now and what's soon to come. And those have been some of my favorite conversations. You know, it's really just proof right there in real time that it does not have to be a long parade of despair and fear and anger and polarization as the world seems to be so engaged with now. So, you know, Jack, I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm happy that we got together to primarily talk about your new book, which I know I watched you be working hard on that book for a long time, for quite a while. And I know that you put your heart and soul into that book, and it was not easy. There were some difficulties or some challenges with the publishers, and you know, just the usual stuff of trying to write a book while life is going on. Mm-hmm. So it was a pleasure to be able to be just a shoulder to cry on, or a person to talk to and share with during that process. And your book, The Climate Cure, Heal Yourself to Heal the Planet. I've really been looking forward to for quite some time to talking with you about it, because you gave me one of the galleys to read before it was published, and there's so much overlap, as I think you and I know, because we've talked so often. There's so much overlap with entirely different jargon and so on, but there's so much overlap in spirit between your body of work and mine. And I really, I just have a deep appreciation for what you put into the book, from the quotes that you pulled on and the other resources, to the overall context that you bring to this particular way of seeing the predicament-laden world we're in, and how shall we comport ourselves in the face of it. So I'm just really glad you're here, Jack, and I look forward to us connecting a bit about the deeper story that you might be able to offer us of what it was to put that together from your history, from your expertise, from your really the wisdom that you've gathered over these years. So, hi.
Hi.
And I'm wondering if you could just start us anywhere you'd like to share with us about this book. Either about its message or about anything that comes to mind about what it was like to produce it into this world that we're in now. I just love for you to share about that, either the book itself or the process.
Well, as usual, when you were speaking, I was wanting to chime in, but I let you just finish your thing there. So I have numerous points that I have logged into my head here. Yeah. So I really appreciate your support while I was writing the book, and I did need to cry to you a few times, and you were there for me in a hero's way. So thank you. So the book has really been a long journey. I've written it over the last 6 years. It was just released in September here of 2020, the longest year in human history. That made me laugh. Honestly, I began writing the book because I was pissed off. I was upset. I had just, well, not just, but I had kind of gotten a download from Guy McPherson a number of years ago, and I was processing that, about his near-term human extinction predictions. And I went through a period of grieving pretty heavily and being depressed for a good couple months or so. And then I just got angry, and I was, I've seen the problem of human nature both in myself and in the world around me. And a lot of the problem of human nature has seemed to me about, well, it's multifaceted, as you and I know, and we'll get into talking about some of that via the triangle of resilience relationships. But, we've really broken away from the baseline sustainability and functionality model of what has allowed human beings to do okay on the planet. Not great, but good enough, better than we're doing now for a long period of our history and prehistory. So I began writing the book actually as a sort of like a bit of a fuck you to the universe, in a sense, in that I saw the problems and I wanted to just say, all right, well, if we're all going to hell in a handbasket soon, I am going to write out like what we could have done better. So I was upset at that time. And then as time went on and I realized that Guy McPherson didn't have the last word or the best accuracy about what was happening, I began to have some realistic hope. And so I was able to push out with a lot more care. And so really care for ourselves, how to care for my training in Chinese medicine has sort of been, my bones have been steeped in that medicine and that the philosophy of Taoism and yin and yang for many years. So it's second natured for me to live in the world, be in the world, think in the world in terms of yin and yang and living in accord with the seasons. So I think the paradigm of yin and yang is a great place to start. And I won't jump into it right now or just yet. I'll just sort of, I wanted to say too that the process of writing the book, it actually, I wrote the book by accident, and people ask me, well, how do you write a book like that by accident? But it really did happen by accident. Of course, it was deliberate as well, but I had a collection of poems that I wanted to publish 6.5 years ago titled Rebirth. And it's a beautiful collection of poems, which still hasn't been released. But I went to write an introduction to that collection, and that introduction just kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And it took about 5 years to finally totally divorce itself from the poems and became its own animal. And that's when I contacted my agent and I said, hey, I have this book. And, we pitched it to the publishing world. And I got a deal and then worked my butt off pretty hard for a year and a half to make everything right for the publisher. So that's a bit how it happened. So it happened by accident, it happened quite organically. I didn't think I'd get a publishing deal, so I just kind of wrote wrote my heart out for that time, and I ended up writing two books in one. So I had to cut it down by about half when when uh, when it was being prepared for the publisher after they accepted it. So that's it. I'll just kind of leave yin yang in the balance here, and I want you to respond. But I also just want to tie yin yang to a word that you mentioned in your introduction, which is polarization. Whew, and I think that's kind of a key word for us to keep in mind this afternoon, because polarization happens with black or white thinking. And one of my biggest pet peeves on social media and in discussions and in articles and especially on memes on social media is the black or white framing of so many arguments, so many recommendations, so many opinions. And that polarization, has been exacerbated, of course, by our president, who's hopefully on his way out very quickly here. Uh, but the polarization is just, it's not this, it's that. And that's really not how life works. Most of life is shades of gray, and that doesn't apply to um, facts or what's most likely true. So that's sort of a bit of a separate category. So then people start, in that context, people start questioning, the veracity of science and consensus science and peer-reviewed science, and that we can trust as being mostly true. But a lot of other philosophical considerations, moral considerations, social dynamics occur as shades of gray. And I've written an article too on that subject, using yin yang and this black or white polarization as a fuel for racism itself, right? Is it black or white? And seeing things as so cuttingly different. And so I just want to keep that little idea in mind here and kind of drop back into yin and yang whenever you want me to go into that. And I'll just pause there. Okay.
It's interesting. It's the first time I've heard you share about the uh, accidentally wrote a book. That's a fascinating thing. It's just so very different than mine, which was unfortunately deliberate from moment one. But I'm really ready to go toward that conversation of yin and yang and
Okay.
the ironically the non-binary version of yin and yang, of the nuance that is
Yeah.
implied. Because I think where we're headed today is to really explore what you're meaning, really the full picture of what you're meaning when you include in your title, heal yourself to heal the planet, especially those aspects of ourselves that are not usually the type of inner work that people are really excited to take on and feel good about it. It's, it can be the stuff that really is some of the hardest work I've known, but also some of the most rewarding work. And I'm anticipating that you have a very similar framing for that. And so I'd say wherever you'd like to go in that direction, I'd be thrilled to follow.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree with everything you've said. And sometimes I think it's a calling to do the inner work in a deep kind of way and go through all that pain with no guarantee, right? That life is going to be any better after that. Okay. So last month or so, I did an interview for the Canadian Eco-Psychology Network, CEN, and maybe we can post the link along with any information that's on this interview, Dean, because that's a great, it's a great intro to what I'm going to say without getting too bogged down in all that, which I kind of did in that interview. And then there wasn't time to get to some of the stuff that I really want to talk with you today that we share in common a lot.
Mhm.
So, uh, so yin yang, I think most people know the yin yang symbol. If you don't know the yin yang symbol, the yin yang symbol means that light and dark have to be together. They have to be integrated with one another. So the yin yang symbol is a symbol of wholeness, right? It's the circle of wholeness, and it's not just cut down the middle, but it's a swirl. Now, why is it a swirl? Because those are gradations, right? And it's also the it invokes the transitionality of life, and that things aren't so stark and linear, right? They're more curvy, and they're more, we have pauses, and we go through shades of gray. And I won't get too carried away in that, but a lot of that discussion is in the interview I just mentioned. So so the yin yang symbol says that life is both light and dark, and the lightness can represent, for example, consciousness, awareness, whereas yin represents the unconscious, um, the dream world. Yang, the light half, represents uh, daylight and activity. The yin side represents nighttime and repose and rest. Uh, the yang side represents um, kinetic energy. The yin side represents potential energy, storage. Yang side represents individuality and forging forward and linearity. And the yin side represents sharing and community and circular cycles in life. So the yin yang symbol on a whole is in a sense very yin, in the sense that it's circle. It's a feminine sort of becoming, and it's also the symbol for life, death, and rebirth. And the life part happens in the yang side. That's where things are abundant and giving and active and alive and outward. And the yin side represents where things decay and go down and go in and compost, right? So that's the death, decline, and death. And then the rebirth happens in spring. So that's as the dark side in the bottom part of the swirl where it gets thin. In the bottom part of the swirl where it gets most rotund, that's the depths of yin. And then after that, the yang begins to grow in that little tail of the white side that goes up and curls up, and that's the light coming back. So that's the endless parade. That's the endless cycle of life, and that model makes possible the notion of regeneration. So yin yang is a symbol of regeneration. That is it. So if the yin yang cycle in the yin yang balance depicted by that simple black and white diagram, pictogram, is messed with, right? Like if you have too much yang going on, then yin's going to suffer and the whole is going to suffer. If you have too much yin going on, too much darkness, then the yang is going to suffer. So the idea in Taoist philosophy and Chinese medicine is that we want to have yin and yang balanced. And in our culture and in most of the world today, the problem is that we have way too much yang happening. Right? We have too much outwardness, too much glitz, too much activity, too much go, 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 too much doing, not enough internality, not enough restoration. That's not only in ourselves, but also how we treat the earth, right? Because human beings are arguably the greatest influence on the planet. So the way that we conduct ourselves has an influence on the natural world, on the planet itself. So we see that happening with climate change, with global warming, in the sense that yin and yang are becoming more polarized, right? That's the extremes of weather. So when we have, so global warming, climate crisis is not, contrary to popular ignorant notion, is not just everything's getting warmer, right? It's getting warmer, but it's also the other extreme where it's also getting colder in areas as the jet stream gets more and more compromised, and Earth systems just start to break down. So we begin to see that the polarization, right, and the separation of yin and yang, the separation of hot, which is yang, and cold, which is yin in temperature, we also begin to see it in ourselves, right? So the book argues that the yin yang imbalance in the world is created by our own imbalance because we've affected the world, we've caused climate crisis. So the book is an exploration for how to get our own shit together, right? And now we have to do it simultaneously, so we actually take wise action in the world. Just overarchingly, humanity, these times are a call to yin. It's a call to the sacred feminine, which is the earth itself, and to restoration, to rejuvenation, and to regeneration via stoking that dark side of life, right? The dark side. So when we've been too much in the yang, so we have enough yang, and it's burning out the planet and drying it out. And so we need to return to things that are more restorative. And that's kind of the overarching message of the book. And more specifically and categorically, I go into the emotions in the book. And it's again, the argument, which is also a hypothesis, is that you know, current neuroscience shows that most of our decisions and actions and beliefs are based upon emotions. So even before we are aware that emotions are triggering our beliefs or our decisions, an emotion or emotions have already occurred, even at a subtle level inside of us, that are causing those actions to occur. So we're not actually making the decisions from our intellect, from our discursive thinking, as much as we like to believe we are. So the hypothesis, right, or the argument is that, if our emotional lives are not in a harmonious way, if they're not in a yin yang kind of sustainable, transformative um, uh, uh, dynamic, then we're not going to make good decisions, and we're going to project and we're going to displace that inner yin yang imbalance onto the world. So, in keeping with the darkness of the yin side, the book is a lot about going into the places that are difficult. So, in a sense, another overarching message is that we have to abide difficulty. And one of my favorite poets and writers, Rainer Maria Rilke, also said that, back in the earlier part of the last century in his writing, and it's part of why I resonate with him so much. He said, we have to keep to difficulty, and it's true because humanity wants to go into denial. So denial is also feeds the yang side. Denial, defensiveness, all that prevents us from being more porous, being more open to looking and diving into the depths. So depths are also characteristic of yin, and the superficie is characteristic of yang. So we have to sink down into this yin, this sort of archetypal yin in life. And I further boil that down in the book and expand upon the importance of doing the difficult emotional work, which means going into that cycle, that side of the yin yang symbol, which is decline, which is marked by the autumn season, by the earth season, by the late summer and the earth element, and fall and the metal element, and then water, which corresponds with the winter season. And the emotions that correspond with those three elements that I just mentioned on the yin side of the cycle are self-reflection. So that's earth. So in traditional Taoist philosophy, self-reflection begets grief, which begets fear. And learning how to cope and how to deal and how to embrace those three primary emotions is crucial for keeping that yin yang cycle functioning and flowing. And then on the yang side, we have anger, which is it corresponds with the the spring. So, but primarily it's really keeping that yin cycle flowing. And when we don't abide our grief, when we don't abide fear, and I could get into a whole thing about fear, but we're not going to have time for it. But I wrote an article about fear, and there's a really good article on my blog post about fear, and I encourage listeners to go check that one out. It's something like love, fear, and fear of fear. So so if we don't abide this yin side, then the yin yang cycle gets wrenched, right? It's like throwing a wrench in the gear system. So we need to keep that yin cycle transforming from light to dark, from life to death to renewal. And the yin yang symbol is this beautiful overarching symbol for eco psychology, for soil regeneration, for planetary regeneration, and for regenerating ourselves. So these are all some of the dynamics that I go into in the book. And I just want to end this thought on I just want to bullet point the importance of doing the emotional work and doing the inner work. So that's shadow work, that's grief work, that's anger work, arguably part of grief work and shadow work. So that inner work, and also healing and encountering the wounds that we've carried around with us. Because if we don't address the pain and the trauma that we carry in our body mind, that gunks up the system also. And that gunks up this transformation of yin and yang. So it's mentioned, I think, in the shadow work chapter, but for listeners, the four crucial boons of doing the emotional work are: one, that we get to heal our past to an appreciable degree. So we get to clear out a lot of the pain, and that happens a lot through grief work. And I went through a massive stint of that in my 20s. And the second boon of doing the emotional work is that it helps us cope with the crisis that we're dealing with right now. Right? So if you don't have emotional intelligence skills for how to deal with anger, how to deal with the grief and the despair, and hopelessness, and to deal with fear and anxiety, you're going to be incapacitated, and you're not going to be able to be full in your own life. You're not going to be able to contribute to the world around you very much, or as much as you could. So that's number two. Number three is that when we're able to undertake this transformational emotional dynamic and work with it and actually move through stuff, we're more able to connect with one another. We're more able to be effective in the world, like I just said. And the fourth is that, and this is mentioned in the book too, and it has to do with projection, and Jung talked a lot about this, is that if we don't deal with our own darkness, right, and that darkness is fertile darkness, it becomes infertile when we don't deal with it. It becomes lethal when we don't deal with our darkness, and we're experiencing that through Donald Trump right now, especially, is emblematic of that. So when we're able to work with the substrate and the darkness of our own being, which is beautiful and which gifts life, then we don't project as much of it onto the world. So we stop destroying the world as much when we tend to and heal and work through the pain that's in our own hearts and minds. And the framework that I create in the book for that is that not only how to do that with each emotion, but also the broader support that we need to go through those processes, which is the triangle of resilience relationship, which I mentioned, which is, an intimate relationship with ourselves, where we're able to be alone, when we're able to regulate ourselves and just pay attention to ourselves and care about doing the work, like you had alluded to before. And then our relationship with one another, that we need one another, we need a sense of community, even if it's just a therapist and a couple good friends, but also having fun is really important and being joyous. So that's community. And the third facet of the triangle of resilience is our relationship with the natural world, and to stay connected and to nurture that relationship so that we remember it. We remember when we're out in the natural world that we absorb lessons from the natural world that we're not even conscious of. It's like the natural world is filled with the primordial matrix of how we've evolved for thousands, if not millions of years. And when we're in cities only, we're filled with the Industrial Revolution. And that is not a model of sustainability. And it doesn't fill our psyche and our cells and our inner imaginations with life promoting symbols and inputs.
Again, I just find it so interesting how from such different bodies of work, such different lineages that you and I come from, there again just seems to be so much overlap. Like there were a number of times when you were exploring that layout that you were just offering that I just couldn't help but think of the way that my far simpler, less rich, I think, way of describing this situation we're in is that we've disconnected. What got us here is we disconnected from all the core sources of meaning in a human life, from deeper self, other people, earth, and soul. The only thing I've, from my particular conclusions, I think I come to a less optimistic proposed conclusions, set of conclusions for our world than you do. And really all I can see to do is to engage in practices of reconnection. So I kept seeing what you were describing in each of the dimensions that you're talking about as practices for reconnection. It just seemed to be a perfect overlap. Different words, but the spirit of it seems to be so much the same. Jack, do you mind if I'm going to ask you kind of a rough question because it lives roughly for me. And I don't mean to be rude. I know you can take it. We have some pretty fun conversations, and I mean it in a fun way. An oddly fun way. As I just tried to describe the shadow that's running our world that you've already mentioned with Donald Trump and so on, we appear to be in a world that is not just the only problem is certainly not just Donald Trump or the Republicans in the USA or some other subgroup that we can point at each other. It clearly has to do with these shadow elements that you've been talking about, that there are other forces that we're not conscious of that clearly are more powerful than the way we'd like to present ourselves. I'm speaking more generally about the USA and how we like to talk about American exceptionalism and our innovation and our genius in technology will save the day, and we are the exceptional people. It'll all turn out just fine. When it's quite obvious to anyone who has a bit of an outside view, as most of the world does, we're driven by shadow. And I'm just curious if you could get a little more pointed about what is the deal? Why have, for the past 40 years, since we were first told about the quite clear projections of, if we keep doing this human operating system this way, in the industrial complex of the world, that we're going to go down. We're going to majorly alter the world's climate, and we're going to take ourselves out. And in those 40 years, we've done nothing but intensify and accelerate all of the measurable negative impacts.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's just desperately shadow driven. And so it really, the stakes are really high in what you've been describing, that the inner side, the inner work that's implied on the more individual level. And God knows what it would take on the cultural, on the larger scale. I just, my head explodes. I'm wondering if you could say more, kind of turning up the heat, like, because the stakes are apparently so high. Is there any shift in the tone of your work and your perspective when you really start to offer out some of these negative impacts that have been building for a long time, completely unhindered? I guess I'm just asking for, how do we address this at a level that comes anywhere near matching the intensity of the shadow?
Everything you touched on, I want to speak about for 20 minutes, but I can't. So I'll just say it this way. So back to the yin yang symbol, right? And the shades of gray, so that it's not black or white. It's not like we're going to save ourselves or we're not going to save ourselves. It's not that we're, going to have total collapse or we're going to have no collapse. And the message in the book, and you and I share this, is like, and Carolyn Baker shares this with us: do whatever you can, right? Do what you can, do what's right, do what's righteous, do what's integrated, do what has integrity. And how does integrity happen? It happens through integration. How does integration happen? It's through making yin and yang happen together. Yeah. So when you talked about, I mean, that was one of the questions I asked before you and I even knew each other when I was writing the book. It's like, how can we, knowing what we know, and this is like in the introduction or chapter 1, how can we march towards collapse knowing what we do? It's like suicidal, right? It's just stupid. So, but it's not just stupid. It's like why people voted for Donald Trump. It's not because they're stupid per se, right? They're deeper forces happening here, and that's also an essay I just wrote about. But anyway, so not to get sidetracked. So to whatever degree we can free up ourselves, right? To whatever degree we can free up ourselves, the better. Who knows if, I like to say too, a little term I use in the book is, nobody knows the precise design of the future. So when doomers say, oh, there's no chance for anything, they don't know that. Mm-hmm. Yes, things look pretty bad, but they don't know that, right? Nor do deniers of doom and deniers of the seriousness of the crisis know to what degree we're going to be able to save and thrive anything. So we're in unknown territory. So we have to embrace this unknown, and we can do whatever we can in a shade of gray. So in terms of shadow work, it's like, who knows what can happen on a global level, but what can we do individually? What can we do ourselves? What can we do with our family, with our friends, in our community? And that's where I focus. It's like, act locally. So another point is that, there's justified criticism of doing inner work, right? To like, like that's going to change the outer. And so what I mentioned in the book, and to be clear to viewers, is that it's not just about doing inner work. It's about doing the inner work so that you can be vitalized to do something else besides besides, ironically, the paradox is that when you don't do inner work, you're self-obsessed and you're bogged down by yourself. Not that we all don't have moments of that, right? Um, but when you can grow up and get your shit together and do some of the initiation work into psycho-spiritual adulthood, which is learning how to be a person of integrity and to act in the world in ways that are helpful 7 generations from now, then that's an initiation. And I think that this kind of work is that initiation, but it doesn't stop there. It has to go into the world. So for example, in Extinction Rebellion, which, I co-founded the branch here in Ojai, we're out in the streets, we're talking to city council, we're trying to make some things happen in Ojai, and we've been successful. And but there's so few of us that are doing that. And people say, "Oh, I'd like to join you. Oh, this, oh, that." So not enough people are getting together to do this. So there's research that I quote in the book as well, that was done uh, for I forget the exact terms, but the threshold amount of people, right? It's like the 100th monkey thing. The threshold amount of um, percentage of a society that needs to take action and that needs to rebel to create systemic change, and it's like 1.5%. I think that's it, and that's been challenged, and but whatever. But that actually happened in New Zealand last year, with the climate marches. Was last year or the year before, with the climate marches, and they made sweeping commitments to carbon reduction, etc. So the inner work is like to get you motivated, to get you in the street, to get you to be able to make some sacrifices, right? It's like, oh, sacrifice. I don't want to make it. No one wants to make any sacrifices. Well, how the hell do we think we're going to get anywhere if we can't make a sacrifice whose etymology comes from the word sacred, right? Like we have to remember what's sacred. And that doesn't mean consuming and having everything perfect and the way we like it, which perpetuates this heat engine of society. So we have to break away from that. And I go into a nice little um, dive into grief work and how grief work, in a way, prepares our psyches to do without. Because when you go into when I'll speak personally, when I've gone into grief, it's like I've learned how to be with intimately with pain. When I'm deep in grief, like I hardly feel like doing anything. And you learn to be in this kind of paradoxical, I won't call it joy, but this paradoxical beauty, that's present in grief. It's like this bitter sweetness, and
Mm.
that bitter flavor, pings
Yeah.
back to Chinese medicine too. But so anyway, so it's going through the inner initiations help us recover the world that we care about. And and I begin in the book in chapter 1 and in the introduction by talking about how to restore our sense of care. And just in brief, and this pings back to what you were saying, how do we care enough? That's the question I ask. How do we care enough? How do we care even enough to be concerned and bothered that we don't care enough, right? Like people don't even care enough that they don't care enough, or that we don't care enough. And I track that back to the pain that we carry in ourselves. That when you have pain, it's like you don't know beauty enough, right? Or you know it in certain slices of life. And so if we could just regenerate ourselves and maybe just have a big pain catharsis collectively, it could bring back our sense of being sensitive to the world again, of being able to care for the world, to appreciate it, and appreciate the things that are simply beautiful.
It's the way I've heard that spoken of is the unmetabolized grief, the unmetabolized separation, that pain of separation for so long. Neither of them metabolized in our system. all of it projected out into the world. So yeah, I hear you. Yes, the time goes quickly when we talk. And
Are we there
no,
already?
it's not possible to cover all the ground we wanted to cover. I would like to visit just a bit more, if it's all right with you, in this last little chunk that we have together for this time. You have such a repertoire of, in your work serving as a healer for so long and facilitator. um you've just got this incredible wealth of resources, of self-regulation, of co-regulation, of resilience skills from a number of different lineages. And I'm just curious, what could you offer someone for whom this conversation is possibly not new, but to really start to own my own presence in this, and own some of the shadow pieces that you've been talking about? How can I better equip myself with the inner resources, and for that matter, the external resources that could help me in that process of integrating shadow, of understanding and diving into shadow in order to integrate it further, and find some of that freedom that you were also talking about on the other side of that work. Any suggestions for some of those inner and outer resources?
Yes. So first of all, I just want to apologize to anybody that, you know, I love to weave things together. And sometimes when I speak, I just weave a bunch of stuff in it, and it can dilute the discussion, but it's just how I am. So I hope for everybody's sake that what I said was clear and not too diluted. And I appreciate you're just boiling it down to this, Dean. And I'm thinking about an example that I use in the book is that, well, first of all, I'll say that a lot of the devil is in the details. And so it's hard to just bullet point these things. It's really a process. It's a deep study, as you know. So I would say read the book, and read your books, and read some of Carolyn Baker's work, and read some of the references that are in my book, in which you're included. And so one of the examples I use in the book is that I think we need inspiration. So back to what you were saying in the beginning of of our conversation is like, this work isn't very much fun, right? So it's really soul work. So that's what soul is. It's like you go through something that's not fun, and especially in America, like doing things that aren't fun or not very popular or appealing. So it's like a calling, but we can also stoke a calling inside us to get into this work. And I try to give people a taste of what that's like. And I say, imagine a friendship, or imagine a relationship with a family member, or your lover, or your husband, or your wife, or a sibling. And imagine a time when you've had a falling out, you've had a disagreement, and to whatever degree you've sat down or picked up the phone and you've talked through it, and you have understanding, right? And just to be able to do that takes a certain, baseline of skills. But to be able to work through something, and I think we've all experienced that to some degree, to be able to work through that and to be on the other side of it with renewed trust, renewed connection, renewed joy. Okay? That's a microcosm. That's a taste of a longer stint of going through a period of difficulty where you can voice and feel and work through your pain and come out the other end. So I offer that small example. And I think your other question, or your tag on question, was how can we begin shadow work? And I think shadow work is really, just to define it, maybe, is just, the stuff inside us that's in the dark, that's untended. And those are ideas, those are beliefs, but especially their feelings and emotions. And I would just maybe use the example that I just gave and think about that and then, you know, oh, and then seek that you were talking about outer resources, get together with people. We need people to be with, to share with, to process our stuff. And if you don't have friends like that, try to make some friends like that. People who will listen, people who care about the inner life, people who care about what's sacred in the world.
Yeah. Jack, I have a prediction. I predict that you and I may just put together a webinar in which that's extremely experiential and really offers a wide range of what this work can feel like. So some of the tough things and also some of the beauty, some of the really um, heartbreaking realities that need to be confronted,
Hmm.
and also some of the extraordinary intimacy that can happen when we do this work with other people. I predict that you and I may just create that kind of webinar in the
Well,
next year.
we'll see what the precise design of that future looks like.
Yeah.
I'm open to it. And I just want to, say a note to listeners that, like I said, it's hard to get into this stuff really deeply just within the hour. So I mean, I'm so happy that I wrote the book because I've only given pieces of it before in my life. And in the book, I spent 6 years bringing it all together. So it's together there.
Mhm.
And I'm so happy that I can just say that it's here. Like, here it is.
Yeah.
So anyway, I look forward to it, Dean, and I'm glad you had me here, and I'm sure it's not the last time we'll do this, and we'll
Yeah.
begin brainstorming for the next.
Yeah. And Jack, I just want to add one more acknowledgement before you go. Um, I know that you had a tremendous amount to do with bringing some healing, bringing some grounding to your community that suffered a tremendous loss in the volcanic eruption over in Hawaii
Hmm.
a couple of years ago now.
Oh yeah.
And I also know that, as you mentioned about your participation with bringing XR into the Ojai area and your other ways of adding to your community, you are clearly walking your talk about, the piece about uh, building a healthy community presence as a part of the practices that you're suggesting in climate cure. You're doing it, you're living it.
Hmm.
And so I just want to point that out because it might not be obvious here. We have a conversation about,
Yeah,
various
yeah,
aspects.
yeah. And
And
Dean,
yeah,
can I jump in real quick on that?
sure.
It brought
Yeah.
up something from before, is that you mentioned the resources that I have, and most of the resources that I have are from going through it personally. So I
Mm.
went through the grief work. I've dealt with my anger, and I'm always dealing with it. So a lot of what I bring is I've been through personally. So that just came up when you were speaking.
Yeah.
And what I've actually done is that to frame it for people, to give people a taste, to you know give a conceptualization of what the work is. And because I like to weave things and I'm a poet, is that I frame it in terms of Chinese medicine because lo and behold, when I was in Chinese medicine school and in depth, somatic psychotherapy at the same time, I was like, holy shit, like this is the medicine that I'm studying provides the model for what I'm going through right now
Yeah.
in a different paradigm. But it was, but it's the same poetry of predicament.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to toss that in.
There's nothing quite like sharing one's experience, hard earned experience, rather than just um, throwing about some flowery words.
Yeah.
Makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
Jack,
And
it's
I've
just a pleasure to have you here. And I look forward to our next opportunity to have some conversation, and I'm going to keep bugging you about that webinar of
Okay, you won't have to bug me
2021.
too much. You won't have to bug me too much. So thanks, Dean. I really appreciate it. And it's always great talking with you and to you and around the stuff that we share.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.